It turns out that our political beliefs might not be the result of our environment. It might actually have a little bit to do with genetics. Let's take a look.
A British study has revealed that conservatives' brains have larger amygdalas than the brains of liberals.
Amygdalas are responsible for fear and other primitive emotions, which could explain why Republicans here in the US are more susceptible to fear-mongering terror alerts than Democrats.
At the same time, conservatives' brains were also found to have a smaller anterior cingulate, the part of the brain responsible for courage and optimism, which is probably why liberals are generally more hopeful and willing to take on big, tough challenges like healthcare reform.
That's really interesting, especially when you look at the structure of our brains and how a Republican differs from a Democrat, how a liberal differs from a conservative. And Avi, you've actually written an entire book about this topic, how our genetics play a role in our political beliefs and our views. How much legitimacy is there behind videos like the one that we just watched? Is this just liberal propaganda? Because it seems very nice to liberals, right? Or is there actual legitimacy behind it?
Well, I would caution against the sort of partisan triumphalism when we look at these findings, or using words like hardwired. In fact, study after study has shown that approximately 50% of the variance in our political attitudes comes from genetic differences between individuals, and the other half comes from the environment.
So talk a little bit about the Pew Research study on twins. I thought that was so interesting because they looked at identical twins and they looked at fraternal twins. And of course, there's a difference between the two. And they realized that if you are identical twins, you are more likely to hold the same political beliefs. But if you're fraternal twins, that means that you're not identical, that you might differ in your political beliefs, right? And of course, you're raised in the same environment. So in that case, the one thing that's different is your genetics. So can you talk about that a little more?
Absolutely. This is an important study. It's replicated earlier findings that go back several decades. And study after study has found that a very important component of this variance in our political beliefs does have this genetic origin. And you know, it's funny, there's a bit of a difference between liberals and conservatives in the way that people look at what comes from nature versus nurture, which is a problematic thing. But some political psychologists like John Hibbing, Kevin Smith, and John Alford recently pointed out there's a funny hypocrisy, which is that liberals are more likely to look at the sources of these social attitudes or attributes coming from the environment, but they'll make an important exception, which is for sexual orientation, which they insist is genetic. However, conservatives are more likely to say that sexual orientation is a choice. Not all, but many of them. However, when it comes to a trait like intelligence, they'll say this has a genetic cause, right? But liberals say, no, that all comes from the environment. So it turns out that our perceptions of these things aren't necessarily the best tool to understand or to study human bias
well,
itself.
Well, it sounds like we're feeding our own bias, like whatever we're picking and choosing depending on what we want to support in our worldview and our political beliefs.
Yeah, I mean it's really fascinating stuff. I love that you pointed out that hypocrisy. And Kelly, when you consider the fact that genetics do play a role in our political beliefs, is there any hope in lessening this polarized environment that we have right now, where people are so firm in their beliefs that they're unwilling to work together to come to some sort of compromise in government?
Well, I mean, we've been able to compromise before as humans. And if this is a biological basis, humans have been around for a while in this kind of biological shape that we're in. So there is potential for it, but I do find it interesting that there is this kind of this immediate filtering of information through these different parts of the brain. And I think, as with anything, I think both of these things are important. I think we have to be in somewhat, fear-based to make sure we're safe and secure, and at the same time have to acknowledge that connection is important also for humans. So, that this is the problem these days, is that we're not accepting that the other side might have something good and important that actually supports what we're all trying to do here. I mean, that's what it always comes down to. So, but my fear is that if the brain thing is used too much, that then they'll probe our brains and want to change them.
Yeah,
I mean, on some like crazy dystopic, kind of point of view.
A lot of Americans deserve lobotomies, let's be honest.
Yeah, or I've already had them, maybe.
Fair point.
If only.
Yeah. So Lee, what are your thoughts on this? I mean, the whole nature versus nurture argument. Do you think that, considering the fact that our brains play a role and our genetics play a role, is it possible for us to actually accept information and change our political beliefs based on what's in our environment or based on logic as opposed to our genetics?
Yeah, and it depends on how it's presented to people. I mean, in my case, I think I came by my politics more because of nature, because I was molested by the Westboro Baptist Church when I was little. But, you know, it could be a lot. It was a joke. It's all right. You look really nervous, Anna. It's going to be all right. We're going to get through this.
I did look
Hang in there.
Oh my God. We need to stop and like console him for a little bit. Yes, yes. Oh.
No, but what Kelly was saying about, you know, the other side may have some points or whatever. Also, I think it's not always talking about sides. We do such a good job of being like, it's this team and this team. But there's a lot of gray area there where, you know, if we look at it issue by issue, people don't have to be on one team or the other.
Yeah, that's true. That's absolutely true. I mean, what do you guys think about your own political beliefs, right? So I consider myself a progressive, but I also would like to believe, and of course I'm being very, very nice to myself here, that if I'm presented with new information that goes against my beliefs, I will be willing to change my belief. So one example of that was my thoughts on prostitution. So originally I was against legalizing prostitution. Then I heard arguments about why it's better to legalize and regulate it, and then I changed my views, right? And it's all based on logic and the information that's presented to me. I mean, is that what we can expect from the majority of Americans, or do genetic factors kind of take charge, and we don't see that kind of open-mindedness?
Well, your ability to think about a problem and arrive at a different conclusion is definitely admirable. Studies have shown that when you look at large groups of people, and of course we're always thinking probabilistically when we get into this kind of social science research, but people even do basic arithmetic incorrectly if it goes against their predispositions politically.
Amazing. Wow. That's amazing.
Yeah, and sometimes they'll
Yeah, we are.
yeah, so it is worrisome, and sometimes they'll even dig in deeper into their initial position when they're presented with with information that might go against their candidate.
I mean, this was a big change that happened, you know, back in the early 1900s and 1950s when they realized, stop giving people facts and expecting them to come to a solution, to an answer you want them to come to. Instead, manipulate them with fear and whatever advertisers do, you know, tell you you're fat and lonely and you need the solution from that product. So it's, I mean, the people coming up with these things have realized a long time ago, don't give people the facts and expect them to figure it out.
Yeah, and we see a huge issue with the way our media is run right now and some of the propaganda that we see in the mainstream. But I feel like if people are cognizant of our predispositions, they'll be more willing to accept new information as it comes to them. I think part of the problem is people don't like to admit that they're wrong, right? A lot of us have opinions or thoughts or beliefs that are just wrong based on the facts that are presented to us, and it's difficult to take in this new information, accept it as reality or fact, and come to a different conclusion in a public way. So we kind of have to change the mindset when it comes to that as well.
Well, and it's so interesting you bring that up, because I've always thought about, you know, like America needs marriage counseling is what they need. And the thing, when I was a therapist, you would sit a couple down, people would rather be right than try to work out a solution. And that is maddening. And that's, you know, that kind of stubbornness and need to own our position so much, you know, is what I always think will be the downfall of a marriage or of a country. You know, I mean, that's when civil war occurs. I'd rather be right than work this out. And that it seems like we're getting more and more entrenched in that. Although, you know, it's interesting. I was just reading in the paper this morning about Paul Ryan working out this budget deal. You know, and he's learning that if he wants to have real leadership, he needs to show he can compromise. You know, so I'm finding, oh, well, this is interesting. So he's learning to have to move towards something, you know. So I don't know, but of course he's a great political animal, so, you know, his ambition.
I definitely agree that a real politician, a real leader has to learn the art of compromise, but unfortunately it's gotten to a point where compromise and concession has been looked upon as some sort of weakness.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So we kind of have to change the thoughts on that. But I think that this is so interesting. I mean, just to know that the way you were born, the genes that you have can actually make you a certain way, politically minded.
We're apes
We
at the
are.
heart of it.
We are.
But he's also saying, you know, I mean, Avi said that 50% of it too is this
Your
other
environment.
aspect, you know, and I think that's where values come in. You know, what do you value? What's important to you? And I was thinking a lot about like the difference between the value of liberty versus justice, you know, which is generally a right-left thing they say. for most issues, and then certain issues come up and that completely switches, you know? So the values are an important part of this, and I'm sure there's some part of the brain that's feeding my value system.
And in some of the most important issues, it's not in us. It's not in our genetics. Like the century of the self. I mean, that took billions, trillions of dollars of advertising and media to tell us we should want and need and be selfish and be alone and want it all for ourselves. Like it took a lot to get us to where we are now. So I don't think that's in our genetics.
So Avi, one final question about the legitimacy of this research, because I always like to question the methodology of these studies. And from what you've seen, would you say that the way these studies are conducted, is it scientifically sound? Is the methodology correct?
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, you have to be careful what study you look at and who's describing it. But I've spent the last 10 years carefully collecting the cutting edge insights from fields like neuroscience, primatology, and genetics from the top, most prestigious peer-reviewed scientific journals. And other people who've been working on this problem have also come to surprisingly similar conclusions. And so there's a pretty high degree of consensus. And yeah, it's very fascinating research. And in fact, I'm optimistic on it because when people start to learn about the evolutionary logic of our political predispositions, when you take that step back, which most people haven't done, something changes. And this is so critical because the more education people have and the more interested we are in politics, both of these factors have a polarizing effect on our dispositions, which means liberals get even more liberal and conservatives get more conservative.
So education really isn't the answer.
It's amazing, but also,
it's a problem.
But here's another problem, though. Okay, we see so many conservative pundits and also political leaders that are Republican that just straight out refuse to believe the science.
I was gonna bring that up.
They
Absolutely.
don't believe the science.
Yeah.
So if they are made aware of these predispositions, I feel like they will just say that no, the science is not sound. We don't believe in this. I mean, you have a group of people in the country that just deny that evolution exists, which is absurd. So how are you going to have a conversation with them about something as complex as genetics playing a role in your political beliefs?
Right, or this study telling me if I'm a conservative, oh, you're just triggering my fear factor inside of me, and then I'm just your monkey or something, your toy or something, like that. They're not going to admit to that. Like, no, I have my own thoughts. I have my own beliefs about this. So yeah, I don't know how far the research is going to go to actually solve our political problems.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, another reason why I'm optimistic is because if you look at an issue like gay marriage, for example, which incidentally polarizes political spectrums all over the world in the same direction, which shows that there are universal elements in the structure of our political orientation. But if you look at that over time, at people's approval of an issue like gay marriage, and then you ask them, do you think this is sexual orientation is something that comes from our biology, or is it a personal choice? And the fewer people say that it's a personal choice, and the more they're saying this is an innate disposition, the approval for issues like gay marriage goes up exactly in the same parallel way. They follow the same chart. So I think the more that we understand that our political dispositions are something that we're born with, and not that our adversaries have some kind of agenda, or they're ignorant, or if they only had the right information, or if we could only convince everyone of something, even if it's evolution, which I agree with, but I know there are people who don't, and sometimes it's frustrating. But we're not just at the edge of some kind of utopia.
Right.
And thinking like that is dangerous. It feels good to think about that right now, but in the long run, these misconceptions of human nature have negative effects, and we have unrealistic expectations. And it is also possible to learn to think in other political directions, almost like acquiring a new language. And I found that while I'm doing this work, and trying to look for years and years at this problem as if I were a biologist visiting from another planet and measuring the personalities of this Homo sapiens and how they're affecting their political behavior. This has created much deeper understandings and created more political moderation for me, and I think greater peace of mind, and that's what I'm really hoping to share with people in our political nature.
Very interesting stuff. Thank you for talking about the science a little bit. Really, really great.